The sun hung low over Red Hollow, a speck of a town baked into the cracked earth of the desert. 300 souls called it home, clinging to the hum of ceiling fans and the clink of coffee cups at Marge's Diner, the only stop for miles. Along the endless highway, dust swirled lazily in the heat, coating pickup trucks and the faded gas pumps outside. It was the kind of afternoon where nothing much happened, where the locals liked it that way, until a low rumble rolled in from the horizon like thunder with a bad attitude. Vance Hawk Malone led the charge, his convoy of 3 rigs tearing through the silence. The trucks hulking beasts of chrome and rust growled as they swung into the diner's gravel lot, kicking up clouds of grit that stung the eyes of anyone foolish enough to stare too long. Hawk hopped down from his cab, boots thudding against the ground, his wiry frame wrapped in a leather vest plastered with skull patches and faded tattoos snaking up his arms. His crew spilled out behind him, 4 roughnecks in stained tees and trucker caps, grinning like they owned the place. Hawk adjusted his shades, a crooked grin splitting his sun-weathered face, and swaggered toward the diner's screen door. "Time to wake this dump up," he barked, shoving the door open with a bang. Inside, the air went still. Locals hunched over their plates, ranchers, retirees, a couple of kids slurping milkshakes, froze mid-bite as Hawk strode in. He didn't walk so much as strut, tossing a chair aside with a clatter to claim a booth big enough for his crew. "Hey, Grandma," he hollered at Marge, a sturdy woman with gray streaks in her hair wiping down the counter. "Coffee, black, and make it quick. We're thirsty out here." His men chuckled, sprawling across the seats, boots scuffing the linoleum. The townsfolk kept their heads down, forks hovering over mashed potatoes, but their eyes darted toward the newcomers. Trouble had a smell, and it reeked of diesel and cheap cologne. Across the lot, past the diner's grease-streaked windows, Elena Carver didn't flinch at the noise. She stood in the shadow of her garage, a lean figure in a faded tank top, her hands blackened with oil as she tinkered with a busted carburetor. Her gray eyes flicked toward the rigs, sharp and unreadable, then back to her work. Beside her, Titan, a German shepherd with a coat like midnight, lounged on the concrete, gnawing a bone with lazy contentment. The rumble of Hawk's arrival didn't faze her. She'd heard louder in worse places. But as the dust settled and Hawk's laughter cut through the stillness, something tightened in her jaw. Red Hollow was her quiet corner of the world until now. The diner buzzed with unease as Hawk and his crew settled in, their voices loud enough to drown out the hum of the old jukebox in the corner. Plates clinked, but the rhythm was off nervous hands fumbling under the weight of Hawk's presence. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the gravel lot where the rigs loomed like sleeping giants. Hawk leaned back in the booth, his boots propped on the table, a half-empty coffee mug dangling from his fingers. He scanned the room with a predator's grin, soaking in the way the locals avoided his gaze. "Bunch of stiffs," he muttered, loud enough for his crew to snicker. Then his eyes landed on something beyond the diner's smudged glass. Titan lay sprawled by the garage, his massive frame relaxed as he gnawed on a knucklebone, jaws working with steady determination. The German shepherd's ears twitched at the distant rumble of a passing car, but he paid no mind to the trucker's noise. Hawk squinted, then elbowed the guy next to him, a beefy man with a patchy beard named Chet. "Check it out," Hawk said, nodding toward the dog. "That mutt thinks he's king of this shithole." Chet chuckled, a low, throaty sound, and the others leaned in, sensing a game. Hawk's grin widened. He snatched an empty beer can from the table, one he'd smuggled in, and tossed it with a flick of his wrist. The can sailed through the air, glinting in the fading light, and clattered against Titan's flank. The dog jolted, bone dropping from his jaws as he let out a startled yelp, scrambling to his feet with a low, rumbling growl. Across the lot, Elena froze. Her wrench hovered over the carburetor, grease-streaked fingers tightening around the handle. She turned her head slow, deliberate gray eyes narrowing as Titan shook off the shock and retreated behind her legs. The can rolled to a stop in the dust, a hollow tinny sound cutting through the stillness. Inside the diner, Marge paused mid-wipe, her rag dangling over the counter. "Oh, hell," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. Tommy, the teenage busboy, peeked from behind the serving hatch, his wide eyes darting between the truckers and the garage. The locals shifted in their seats, a collective intake of breath rippling through the room. Hawk wasn't done. He swung his legs off the table and stood, brushing crumbs from his vest as his crew's laughter egged him on. "What's that pup gonna do, huh?" he called out, loud enough to carry across the lot. He swaggered toward the door, his boots thudding against the floor, and stepped onto the porch. Titan's growl deepened, but the dog held his ground, loyal eyes flickering to Elena. Hawk smirked, then took it a step further. He strode across the gravel, closing the gap, and nudged Titan with the toe of his boot. Not a kick, just a lazy shove, enough to make the dog flinch and bare his teeth. "Look at him jump," Hawk crowed, turning back to his crew with a laugh. They hooted, slapping the table, but Chet's grin faltered, his gaze shifting to Elena. She set the wrench down, the clink of metal on concrete sharp as a gunshot. Her face was stone, but her eyes burned. "He's picked the wrong fight," Marge muttered, clutching her rag like a lifeline. The air thickened, heavy with the promise of trouble. The gravel crunched under Hawk's boots as he sauntered back toward the diner, his laughter still ringing across the lot like a cracked bell. Titan's growl faded into a wary huff, the dog's dark eyes tracking the trucker's every move. Elena stood rooted by the garage, her wrench resting on the workbench, her hands flexing at her sides. The air felt heavier now, the late afternoon sun painting the scene in harsh oranges and lengthening shadows that stretched like fingers clawing at the dust. Inside the diner, the clatter of a dropped spoon broke the silence. Marge's hands weren't as steady as they'd been a minute ago. Hawk shoved the screen door open and strutted back to his booth, his crew's cheers greeting him like a returning champ. "Did you see that mutt jump?" he crowed, slapping Chet's shoulder hard enough to make the big man wince. "Thinks he's tough, huh? Just like this whole damn town soft as butter." He snatched another coffee mug from the table, slurping it loud and sloppy, letting the dark liquid dribble onto his vest. His eyes flicked toward the garage again, catching Elena's silhouette against the fading light. "And what's with that chick out there?" he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "Little lady playing mechanic? Bet she can't even change a tire without crying for help." His crew roared, banging fists on the table, though Chet's laugh came slower, his gaze darting to the window. Tommy edged closer to Marge behind the counter, his bony frame trembling with something between fear and awe. "She's not just a mechanic," he whispered, voice barely audible over the trucker's racket. "I heard she was a Marine, took down a guy twice her size in some bar fight up north. Broke his arm without blinking." Marge's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes locked on Elena through the glass. "Kid's right," she muttered, more to herself than him. "Hawk's stirring a hornet's nest, and he don't even know it." The locals traded glances. Old man Harris with his suspenders, the widow Clara nursing her tea, each face etched with a mix of dread and something sharper, like they were waiting for the punchline to a joke they already knew. Outside, Elena hadn't moved. Her gray eyes followed Hawk's antics, steady as a sniper's scope, but she kept her silence. Titan sat at her feet now, his ears perked, the bone forgotten in the dust. Hawk caught her stare through the window and grinned wider, sensing a challenge. He shoved his chair back with a screech and marched to the door again, his crew trailing like hyenas sniffing a kill. "Hey, grease monkey," he bellowed, stepping onto the porch and planting his hands on his hips. "What's a little thing like you gonna do about your precious pup? Cry to daddy?" The words dripped with mockery, his stance wide and cocky. Daring her to flinch, the diner held its breath. Tommy clutched the edge of the counter, his knuckles white. Clara's teacup rattled in its saucer. Marge gripped her rag so tight her nails dug into her palms. Elena's head tilted, just a fraction, her expression unreadable, but her stillness unnerving. Hawk's grin faltered for a split second, a flicker of doubt in his squint, but he doubled down. "Come on, sweetheart," he taunted, taking a step closer across the lot. "You mad? Gonna fix my truck with those dainty hands? Or maybe you'll just sit there and sulk." His crew hooted again, though the sound was thinner now, less certain. Elena finally spoke, her voice low, cutting through the haze like a blade. "Leave my dog alone." 4 words, simple and steady, but they carried a weight that made the air snap. Hawk froze mid-step, his smirk twitching. "What did you say?" He shot back, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. "You giving me orders now?" He took another step, closing the gap to 10 feet, his shadow falling over Titan. The dog's hackles rose, a rumble building in his chest. Elena's eyes didn't waver, locked on Hawk like a storm cloud ready to break. Inside, Marge shook her. "Head slow. He's got no idea," she whispered. Tommy nodded, breathless. "She's gonna wreck him." The room buzzed with tension, every eye on the lot, waiting for the spark to ignite. Hawk sneered, oblivious, and kicked at the dust. "Let's see what you've got, then," he said, daring her to move. The hornet's nest wasn't just stirred, it was about to burst. The dust hung thick in the air, a gritty veil between Hawk and Elena as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting Red Hollow in a blood-orange glow. Hawk stood 10 feet from her, his boots planted wide, chest puffed out like a rooster ready to crow. His crew lingered on the diner's porch, their laughter fading into uneasy murmurs as Elena's words, "Leave my dog alone," echoed in the stillness. Titan's low growl rumbled like distant thunder, his ears pinned back, eyes glinting with a loyalty that matched his owner's steel. Hawk's smirk twisted into something meaner, his fingers twitching at his sides. "You don't tell me what to do, sweetheart," he snarled, and with a flick of his wrist, he shoved Elena's toolbox off the workbench. The metal box hit the ground with a deafening clang, wrenches and sockets scattering across the concrete like shrapnel. The sound snapped the tension like a taut wire, and Elena moved fast, too fast. Before Hawk could blink, she closed the gap, her lean frame a blur of precision. Her hand shot out, clamping around his forearm mid-gesture, and with a twist so smooth it looked rehearsed, she yanked his arm behind his back. Hawk's knees buckled, a sharp grunt escaping his lips as she forced him down, one knee pressing into the gravel. "What the?" he sputtered, his free hand clawing at the dirt. Inside the diner, Tommy's jaw dropped. Marge's rag fell. To the counter, and Old Man Harris let out a low whistle. "That's the Marine," he muttered, almost proud. Hawk's crew froze, the bravado evaporating as Chet took a half step forward, then stopped. Elena's gray eyes flicked up, locking onto them with a cold promise stay back. She held Hawk there for a heartbeat, his face reddening, veins bulging in his neck, then released him with a shove. He stumbled forward, catching himself on his palms, dust coating his vest. "You little," he roared, scrambling to his feet, his pride a live wire sparking in his chest. He swung a wild fist, aiming for her jaw, a haymaker fueled by rage and embarrassment. But Elena was already gone, sidestepping with the grace of a dancer, her boots barely stirring the dust. Hawk's momentum carried him forward, off balance, and she tapped his ankle, just a nudge, sending him crashing into a stack of tires by the garage. The rubber thudded to the ground, bouncing with a hollow echo as Hawk sprawled across them. groaning, his shades skittering away in the dirt. His crew gasped, a collective intake of breath, while the diner erupted in muffled whispers. "She didn't even hit him," Tommy breathed, eyes wide. Marge nodded, a grim smile tugging at her lips. "She don't need to." Hawk clawed his way up, his face a mask of fury, sweat mixing with the grime on his cheeks. He wasn't done, couldn't be. Not with his men watching, not with the town's eyes boring into him. His hand darted to the scattered tools, fingers closing around a heavy wrench. "All right, tough girl," he growled, flicking it up like a makeshift club. "Let's see you dodge this." He lunged, the wrench arcing toward her side, a desperate swing born of wounded ego. Elena didn't flinch. Her hand snapped forward, catching his wrist mid-motion, her grip iron tight. With a flick of her fingers, she twisted, and the wrench clattered to the ground, ringing against the concrete. Hawk yelped, his arm bending at an unnatural angle, pain shooting up to his shoulder. She stepped in close, her knee brushing his thigh, and swept his legs out from under him in one fluid motion. He hit the dirt hard, a plume of dust exploding. Around him, his breath whooshing out in a ragged gasp. Titan barked once, sharp and triumphant, pacing at Elena's side. The diner was silent now. The locals pressed against the windows, some with hands over mouths, others with barely hidden grins. Hawk's crew shuffled back, Chet muttering, "Shit, man, let's go." But no one moved to help. Elena loomed over Hawk, her shadow long and steady, her face as calm as it had been when she'd been tightening bolts an hour ago. "Still wanna play?" she asked, her voice low, almost bored. Hawk coughed, clutching his chest, and shoved himself to his knees. His pride screamed at him to fight, to prove he wasn't broken, but his body betrayed him, legs shaky, breath short. He glared up at her, teeth gritted, and charged one last time, a bull rush aimed at her waist. Elena didn't blink. She stepped forward, meeting him halfway, and drove a quick, controlled palm strike into his sternum. Not hard enough to crack bone, but sharp enough to steal the air from his lungs. Hawk staggered back, hands flailing, and collapsed against the garage wall, wheezing like a busted engine. His crew stared slack-jawed as Titan growled low, teeth bared just enough to make the point. Elena straightened, dusting her hands on her jeans, and fixed Hawk with a look that cut deeper than any punch. "You messed with my dog," she said, her tone flat, final. "Now you know how it feels." Elena didn't blink. She stepped forward, meeting him halfway, and drove a quick, controlled palm strike into his sternum. Not hard enough to crack bone, but sharp enough to steal the air from his lungs. Hawk staggered back, hands flailing, and collapsed against the garage wall, wheezing like a busted engine. His crew stared, slack-jawed, as Titan growled low, teeth bared just enough to make the point. Elena straightened, dusting her hands on her jeans, and fixed Hawk with a look that cut deeper than any punch. "You mess with my dog," she said, her tone flat, final. "Now you know how it feels." Hawk slumped, his chest heaving, his fight draining into the dust. The town watched, breathless, as the king of the road lay humbled at the feet of a woman who hadn't even broken a sweat. Marge shook her head, a dry chuckle escaping her. "Should have stuck to coffee," she sighed, and for the first time that day, the diner dared to breathe. The dust settled slow over Red Hollow, curling around Hawk's crumpled form like a shroud. He slumped against the garage wall, one hand clutching his chest where Elena's strike had landed, the other scraping at the dirt as he fought to catch his breath. His wrench lay a few feet away, glinting dully in the twilight, a useless relic of his pride. Titan paced beside Elena, his growl softening into a watchful hum, dark eyes fixed on the trucker. Elena stood tall, hands loose at her sides, her gray gaze steady and unyielding. The lot was silent now, save for the faint creak of the diner's sign swaying in the evening breeze. Hawk's crew hovered near the porch, their swagger gone, replaced by a jittery unease. Chet took a step toward Hawk, then stopped, his meaty hands flexing as if unsure whether to help or flee. "Man, come on," he muttered, voice low, glancing at Elena like she might pounce again. Hawk coughed, a wet, ragged sound, and hauled himself to his feet. His vest hung crooked, dust caking the leather, and his face burned red, not just from the fight but from the weight of every eye on him. He glared at Elena, jaw tight, but the fire in his stare flickered, dimmed by the truth sinking in. He'd lost, and they all knew it. Inside the diner, the tension broke like a dam. Tommy let out a shaky laugh, his hands still gripping the counter. "She took him apart," he said, voice cracking with awe. Marge nodded, her grim smile widening as she tossed her rag over her shoulder. "Told you he picked the wrong fight," she said, loud enough for the locals to hear. Old Man Harris tipped his hat toward the window, a rare grin splitting his weathered face. "That's what you get for kicking a dog," he said, and Clara, the widow, chuckled into her tea, her hands steady for the first time all day. The room buzzed with whispers, a mix of relief and quiet triumph rippling through the crowd. Hawk staggered toward his rig, avoiding Elena's gaze, his boots dragging in the gravel. "Let's roll," he rasped, not looking back at his crew. They hesitated, exchanging glances, Chet scratching his beard, another guy kicking at the dirt, then shuffled after him, their steps heavy with defeat. The rigs roared to life, engines coughing and snarling, but the sound lacked the bravado of their arrival. Dust billowed as they peeled out, tires spitting gravel, the convoy shrinking into the dusk until it was just a smear of taillights on the highway. Hawk didn't glance back, didn't dare. His knife-edged world had dulled against Elena's quiet steel. The diner exhaled. Marge stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, and called out, "Hey, Carver, coffee's on. Emmy tonight." Elena turned, her expression softening just a hair, and gave a small nod. "Appreciate it," she said, her voice low but warm. Tommy darted out, his sneakers crunching gravel, and stopped short of Titan, beaming. "That was awesome," he said, eyes bright. "You're like a superhero or something." Elena's lips twitched, the ghost of a smile, and she crouched to scratch Titan's ears. "Just looking out for my boy," she said, and the dog leaned into her touch, tail thumping the ground. The locals trickled out, some nodding at Elena, others murmuring thanks as they headed home. The night settled over Red Hollow, stars pricking the sky, the air cool and clean after the day's chaos. Elena stayed by the garage, alone now, the diner's glow spilling across the lot. She sank onto an old crate, Titan curling up at her feet, and let her mind drift. A memory flickered sand and sweat, a firefight in some godforsaken desert, the weight of a rifle in her hands. She'd left that life for this one, for peace, for Titan's steady breathing beside her. Today had pulled her back, just for a moment, and she felt the old strength still useful, not buried. Marge appeared with a chipped mug, steam curling from the coffee. "You okay?" she asked, handing it over. Elena took it, her fingers brushing the warm ceramic. "Yeah," she said, sipping slow. "He won't be back." Marge chuckled, shaking her head. "Not if he's got any sense left." She lingered a moment, then headed inside, leaving Elena with the quiet. Titan sighed, resting his head on her boot, and she watched the highway stretch into the dark. Red Hollow was hers again, safe, still, and unbroken. Days slipped by in Red Hollow, the desert sun rising and falling over a town that buzzed with a new kind of quiet. The diner hummed again, forks scraping plates, coffee brewing in the pot. But the air carried a story now one folks couldn't stop telling. Marge leaned on the counter, her apron stained with grease and pride, grinning every time a local asked about that day. "Never seen a man go down so fast," she'd say, shaking her head. Elena didn't even blink. Tommy turned it into a saga, acting out the fight for wide-eyed kids, his skinny arms swinging like Hawk's wild punches, his voice rising with each, and then she flipped him. The highway stayed calm, no roar of rigs breaking the peace. Word had spread truckers passing through tipped their hats at the garage, their stops quick and respectful. Elena worked on, her hands buried in engines, Titan dozing in the shade. One afternoon, a lone biker rolled in, his engine a soft purr against the silence. Marge tensed, but the guy just nodded, ordered a coffee, and left a generous tip. "Heard about this place?" he said, glancing at Elena. "Sounds like it's got teeth." She met his gaze, a flicker of amusement in her eyes, then went back to her wrenched dot as the sun dipped low, casting gold over the cracked earth. Red Hollow carried on safe, steady, a speck of resilience in the dust. Elena stood by the garage, Titan at her side, watching the horizon swallow the light. She'd come here to leave the fight behind, but some battles found her anyway. Strength didn't need proving. She knew just showing when it mattered. Somewhere out there, Hawk nursed his bruises, but here, the dust held her story, etched deep and enduring.